The next speaker is from Eupry. It's Jakob Konradsen, who's the Chief Quality Officer and co-founder. He leads quality strategy and regulatory alignment whilst advising pharma and logistics clients on validation operations. So it's very much continuing the theme or one of the themes that we've talked about this morning. His topic is continuous mapping and monitoring in practice, and to avoid something that is, dare I say it, there's every profession has things that we don't like doing, but one of them is no more remapping, which I think is an interesting perspective to take. Jakob, floor's yours.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very nice way of saying I'm a huge nerd in this field, and I'm a proud one. So my daily work is working with our customers and trying to understand what are some of the challenges in terms of compliance in way more than just mapping. But as a focus today, some of the things I would love to go through is a more practical take on how we see continuous temperature monitoring and mapping combined into one. And I was very glad to hear this chat. Really, one of the key terminologies, I think, is turning data into information by providing context in a lot of these scenarios. We work with pharma distributors, pharma companies as well, in the GXP industry. But one of the three things, or the top three things that we see as top of mind when we talk environmental monitoring and environmental compliance is aircrafts. We see a lot of increase in wanting to understand how aircrafts are being monitored, what the situation is, both in real time and also in terms of their compliance level. We see a large demand for, I think every single talk today has been about what we call dual compliance. So basically understanding what the current situation is, not only in terms of stationary goods, warehouses, temperature controlled units, but also on the fly following the goods around. So combining that data, that's what we call dual compliance. And then lastly, continuous mapping and monitoring, which I'll go into in this talk. One of the key concepts here is basically turning a lot of the compliance we have, which is very event-based today as we see it, that we do spot controls along the journey, not only in terms of environmental compliance, into something that's continuous and trying to use that as an advantage, both in terms of making sure that the products are safe, but also turning it into information in your shipping lines, which facilities are performing well, which are not, what is the correlation between when they're performing well and when they're not, and how can we use that to make a risk-based decision on what kind of lines we need to choose. Some of the items we see in continuous in monitoring today is that we often see that we do an initial assessments of these sites. We do initial mapping under specified conditions. And I think that's one of the key elements in this is that the variability in having these sites is very slowed down, because you'll have an initial mapping of these facilities, having an understanding of how the thermal performance is, or humidity, or whatever it might be, that is going to be a point-in-time measurement. And I sometimes compare it as I would be very angry at my auto dealer if he said, well, your next car doesn't come with any warning lights. It's only when you go in for service we'll tell you if something wrong with your car. But today we see that we have these different tasks or jobs to be done throughout the cycle of our monitoring. We have calibration of data loggers, of sensors in order to stay compliant. We have trend analysis, which today, in my view at least, is a very binary trend analysis. We tend to look at data when something has gone wrong. What is the number of alarms we have? What is the performance? Alarm management. And that's something that's very important when we go into a continuous case. We'll get a lot more alarms going on. We have a lot more deviations, but it's something we continue on an ongoing basis. And then these remapping, these reassessments of thermal performance of these, and there were some talks earlier today talking about whether you need packaging if you have all of your logistics in control. I think that's a very nice thought, at least, but maybe we can use some of this thermal data to enhance our view on how much packaging we need and which shipping lines we need to do. When we talk to our customers and we look at some of the industry-leading information coming out, that there's basically 5 criteria that we're hearing. Is first of all product reliability, of course, losses in the supply chain during storage. End-to-end capabilities, so basically being able to gather information from the entire supply chain into one platform, having it integrated. There was a talk earlier before about having hardware agnostic systems, so that you don't need to rely on specific vendors, and that those speak the same language in terms of being able to provide you information rather than just raw data. Logistics and tracking, being able to monitor real time on shipment level. So being able to correspond or gather data not only for fixed installations but also for moving goods, and having that speak the same language. Temperature control, of course, making sure that all shipments, all temperature controlled units are validated and that they're continuously monitored. And then compliance support. We are seeing an increased level via our customers on regulatory oversight in terms of making sure that they are GXP compliant. We're seeing a lot in the US right now. We're having a lot of requests from ensuring that storage and transports live up to the GDP, and a platform that can encompass all of those functionalities. The bold statement for today is that continuous mapping and monitoring solves, or doesn't solve, I would say, but at least enables all 5 of those criteria. So looking forward a bit, some of the items that we're hearing from our customers is that operational excellence, improving efficiency is a key parameter. What we're also seeing a lot of, which has actually surprised me quite a lot in the last few years, is that the end customers of these products have very specialized needs, not only in terms of having the right storage conditions, but also having different needs for compliance, having changing needs over time. There's a increased focus on continuous control. So I think it's very, very important to separate monitoring from control. One of the key elements of being able to control something, I think, is information, so that we're able to understand what is the performance of these different parts of the supply chain, or the constant temperature controlled units, and having the ability to control based on not only current data but also predicted data. So there was, I think, a really nice statement before saying, can you extrapolate based on that? But we already see now that we can actually use AI to predict some of these items so that we can actually control in the future. So moving to continuous mapping and monitoring, the entire concept is going back to this depiction here. So rather than having to remap to do these spot checks every third year, however often you do it, there's a great variability in how often this is being employed. The entire concept here is actually to move into a case where you're continuously mapping, you're continuously monitoring the thermal performance of warehouses, fridges, trucks, airplanes, so that you don't miss a lot of the information regarding seasonalities, loading, and just degradation over time. And just to simplify it a little bit and make it a little bit more practical, I like to show maybe some of how it can actually be used. The traditional method often consists of performing these initial assessments or mappings of the thermal performance of your facilities. During the span of the years, you might have some initial extraordinary checks in order to ensure that the performance is still as we expected. But basically, you go out, you take the loggers down, you place some more, you inspect the performance during 1 or 2 weeks, and then you take it all down again. And the concept of the continuous methodology is actually quite simple, in the sense that whenever you map these facilities, we place a lot of loggers in order to get data of the uniformity and stability, ensuring that all positions are suitable for placement of sensitive goods. But then we just don't take all of them down. It's actually that simple. The whole concept of continuous mapping was actually introduced back in 2011, so it's not a new thing. But just to exemplify, this would be a typical methodology. You'd have a facility and would place loggers in these positions. I think it's quite well known how these guidelines operate. You'd identify your worst case positions, and then you take down the rest of the loggers. And I think it's just for everyone looking at this, it's fairly simple that this will not take into account any degradation of thermal performance over time. It will not take into account what happens if we use different loading patterns, what happens if the usage needs changes over time, what happens if you scale up or scale down the loading and unloading of goods and facilities like this. And I think it's also very important to note that now this is a warehouse, but the same goes for trucks, for airplanes, for reefers. The thermal performance of this methodology, or the insights into the thermal performance of this methodology, is very simplistic, and it's been like that for before I was born, I think. But the entire concept is that we're relying on, I think is a strong word, I would say, hoping that the distribution of temperature does not change over time. In a continuous methodology, the initial approach is the same. We follow all our guidelines in terms of assessing the thermal performance of the facilities. But rather than taking all of these loggers down, we just keep most of them in place. And this gives us an insight into how does these facilities or reefers or airplanes perform when in real operation. You remove some of them. There's a cost element to this as well, I know. And then basically you have a continuous measurement of what the performance is of these facilities. And you can start, some of the things we've started to see is that there are hidden information in the data that we can start to surface because we have this continuously monitored. So just to reiterate the traditional methodology, some of the things, at least from our perspective, is that you get these instant outdated snapshots of performance over time. And I think a lot of that's my personal view, a lot of the reasons why we are starting to see a lot more of these smart labeled loggers following the goods is because we don't have the insight, because we only have these snapshots of time. Of course, there's a myriad of other reasons why, but we in the traditional methodology, we get these snapshots of how we're doing, and we don't get all the variability you do in normal operation. You really have no redundancy. So if we get to, and we've seen this multiple times, that you get to the second pillar here in time and you find out that the thermal performance was actually not as it was. I know that everyone in this room, of course, would go back and trace back all the shipments that were in there and inform their customers, but all of your colleagues do not. So there's a whole lot of redundancy or risk in that. The second part is that often you'd have multiple suppliers involved in this process because you needed some to perform the mapping, you need some to perform the ongoing monitoring, and how do all those speak together, and how do we get a unified picture of how we're performing. There's also the one of the key elements we see, there's a large uncertainty in cost per these, because what does it cost this year, what does it cost in 3 years and 6 years and 9 years, and so forth. And some of the benefits we see with the continuous method is that you have this ongoing assurance of the performance. You get constant data to make sure that all positions, all parts of the journey, at least those that are continuously monitored and mapped, have the performance level that they need. Another big thing we actually see is that these environments are harsh. As someone who I consider myself at least one of the fathers of the system of these data loggers, they often get trashed. So when you have multiple sensors in place, you start having a high level of redundancy of your data points. And then a third point, when we have all these sensors in place, we can basically make on-demand mappings. And some of the benefits of that is not only being sure that we have the performance we need at all times, but also that we can act very rapidly on changing needs. if facilities are going to be used for different purposes, even for different temperature ranges, we can actually pull a mapping report from the system and see whether it still fulfills the compliance requirements that it needs to. And lastly, also one of the elements or the things we often hear from our customers is that whenever we have services to these facilities, change of HVACs or temperature control systems, how do we ensure that this change documentation, you might often say, we'll do a risk-based approach, and in a busy daily schedule that often ends out being a very low risk for some reason, so that we don't need to do remapping. But in this case, you actually get instant change documentation. You know whether these changes have had any negative impacts on the performance. And we actually see a lower total cost of ownership when deploying systems like this. If you take into account the man hours involved in setting up data loggers and handling this validation documentation, even using, it might seem illogical that placing more data loggers, having more calibrations per year, but it actually gives approximately a 25% lower total cost of ownership in the cases we've seen so far. So just as a case example here, we have a large pharma logistics company, and in this case, I've altered it drastically, I should mention. We have multiple sites, 15 sites initially globally as part of a supply chain network. It needs to be fully GDP compliant, both in terms of the customers that you're supplying to, but also in terms of regulators. There needs to be the case, or there's the need for having a global oversight. What we often see in larger pharmaceutical distribution is that having a centralized knowledge hub of people who know how to deal with temperature excursions boosts the efficiency quite dramatically. So having a global oversight of the compliance status, and I think it's now today I'm talking a lot about continuous mapping and monitoring, but compliance is not only that, it's also making sure that calibrations are in order, that systems are set up correctly, that they're being monitored. And also having an audit-ready architecture. One of the things we often hear is that being constantly audit-ready, not only from regulators, but also from customers at any one point in time, is a large driver for being able to adapt to changing needs from customers. So being able to have an architecture that supports the audit documentation you need when you need it at the click of a button. I would lie if I said it was one click of a button, but I think you get my point. So just an example here, a project start in terms of getting site alignment. That's really one of the key efficiency boosters we've seen in implementing systems like that, is that you get the individual sites involved in this new concept. And you had a question before, I think, about whether there was any friction. I think I've never heard of anyone who wakes up Monday morning and says, today I want to fuck up. So once we got that alignment ready with the facilities, it was way easier to get these projects started. And basically within a month, we can get started on the initial mappings, getting it set up, reporting all of this performed. And after 9 months, we are actually operational with continuous monitoring and mapping with calibration and alarming all of the features you don't normally expect. And then after that, it's roughly something like 10 minutes of compliance work whenever you need to perform these remappings. I like to refer to this often when we're talking about the different strategies for ensuring thermal compliance in terms of temperature monitoring, at least. Often, I think it's pretty rare that we see it anymore. The strategy A, having to perform a summer and a winter mapping, waiting in between those, having a minimum lead time of 6 months, if you're lucky, and then going into operation. Over the last 5 to 6 years or so, almost everyone we encounter at least go for a strategy B, in which you perform a mapping, you go into operation and you keep an increased monitoring, but then go back to traditional monitoring. But what we're seeing now is more and more this strategy C, as we call it, so performing initial mapping of these facilities and then going into a continuous mapping where basically you do not need to perform seasonal mappings. You need to perform them, but they are more automatically performed by the system. So in terms of the traditional approach and a lot of what we're seeing is that the mapping is very event-based. It impedes operation. You need to slow down or stop even operations, and you need to perform this very event-based that changes and reviews. On the other hand, with monitoring, we see hot and cold spot monitoring, the very traditional approach with 1 or 2 loggers or in that area. We see a lot of alarm handling, of course, with the individual sensors, but I think there's a whole iceberg of deviations that we haven't seen. I think every healthy patient is just a patient you haven't screened enough, right? We can always search and we can always find more, and you tend to have very simple trend analysis. And trend analysis coming from quality is something that typically resides in the quality department. We don't really want to deal with that in the operations. But one of the things, some of the things we're trying to do is basically go to a continuously mapped facilities, reporting on demand. So whenever you need reporting, you can click a button. Operational interruption free, so don't need to slow down or interrupt operations because you have a real life performance data on how you're performing. And on the monitoring, you basically have a constant assurance of the distribution. You have increased screening, of course. You'll get more alarms, but I have a slide on that later on. So some of the outcomes we've seen from the customers that we've implemented this with is that there's both a heightened assurance. So in a commercial, from a commercial standpoint, basically we get 7 times more data points, and also in that 7 times more information at a lower cost than traditional. We also see way lower time to markets because when we employ this constant mapping, we also get assurance both for our customer and also from regulatory bodies that we do have monitoring of the performance. All of these traditionally event-based items are continuously monitored. We get way lower TCO. If we look at a 6-year period, it's something like 25%, in some cases even more, some cases even less as well. But and we get a large advance in terms of vendor consolidation. So we see when working with these large international companies that every site would need to procure validation staff and vendors in terms of keeping track. We see in the monitoring field, we see a lot more consolidation in terms of global coverage. But in terms of validation, it's still very much 2 men in a van somewhere on site, which means that we're reducing complexity and we get an easier vetting process. Of course, there are some challenges. Some of the challenges that we see and that we're trying to solve here is that you will get more alarms. Because we're screening way more, we're also going to get way more data in, and we need to handle those alarms. What we have done is that we've tried to work with way more efficient alarm handling. A lot of the alarm handling we're seeing today is perceived as chaotic. You need someone who's a trained individual to assess every single deviation, but I don't think that's the case. A lot of these can be rule-based, based on stability budgets, based on mean kinetic temperature. There's a lot of different rule sets that can be set up, and I'll probably get in the wilds for saying this, but which don't need AI to handle them, because they're basic rule sets on how do we handle these alarms, but we can use the information to surface importance and what could be a critical alarm handling. And secondly, also, we do use AI already today. We can say a lot about these alarms that we're seeing. What is the most likely root cause of these? Is it an open door, something that hasn't been closed? Is it unequalized goods? What is it? And how should we act upon those? So we will need to accept, I think, that we will surface the most important alarms, the most important deviations, and let the system handle the rest. I think it also, at least when we're seeing regulators come on site, the whole concept of a mapping, the whole concept of validating these storage conditions is going to be something different. Traditionally, it's something with protocols and execution on site and reporting at the end, but we're seeing a lot of other fields where this is basically vanishing towards having a continuous control and continuous monitoring of these items. And also, we'll get way more information. So what are some of the performance metrics we should act on? what are good metrics. What we have done, and I'll be happy to get some input on that as well, what we've done is saying, okay, if we can compare globally against different sites, not only within the organization, but also with different organizations, we can start to have an idea of what is good performance and what is lower performance, again, to get a global oversight, to have focus on the things that matters the most. Are there any specific influences that affect the performance, weather, usage, and all of these items? And then lastly, we have a way more audit-ready architecture. So basically being able to provide the documentations for customers or for regulators on site exactly when you need it. And then I think it's very important for me to state, well, this doesn't stand alone. This, of course, still needs to be built on top of having a centralized quality oversight, having someone sitting globally to assess all of these changes and the performance. You still need the digital twin. I haven't even been into to this topic, but we're also building this digital twin, gathering all the information that's important, not only for the stationary units, facilities, and so for temperature-controlled units, but also for airplanes, and how can we use that? And of course, we still need intelligent alarm handling. We still need to have these assessments of how it's performing, and the dual compliance. I think one thing, and today I've talked a lot about stationary units and stuff. We still need the smart labels. And we still need to have systems that incorporate the data from several different data sources in order to not only assure that the stationary conditions are well, but also that the moving goods is as we see them. Basically, you can boil it down to the concept of a smart label moving through a facility should measure the same as that facility, right? Those two should correlate. If they don't correlate, we have an issue, because then we have no control over the data we have, and we have no control over the conditions. That's it. I have no idea how much time I used.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Jakob. Okay. Questions from the floor? Pierre.
So just a comment, sir. I've been auditing many companies for our pharma company, and there are only once a warehouse where there were only 2 loggers for the hot and cold spots. Yeah. So usually for us, it's a requirement. So it was a miss in our quality agreement because we didn't specify that we wanted more than 2 loggers. So okay, it was a miss from us. But so with regard to your presentation, I don't see how we could avoid the regular mapping of the warehouses, especially when it's required by the local authorities. Thinking about China, for instance, it's required twice a year. Mm-hmm. So how do you avoid, or how do you show your data so that you can say that it's not needed to remap or whatever?
Yes, so that's a very good question. So one of the things we're seeing is that this is a relatively new concept. As it was introduced by ISP, and I think in the first guidance documents I've seen in 2011. And it's the only place I've seen in a guidance document that says that due to financial reasons, this has not seen widespread introduction. There is, as I see it, a long tail of adoption, and I think it has very much to do with geography in terms of which regulators accept this approach and which don't. There is a mean way somewhere in there between, because it's as the question I've put up there. What is a mapping? Like for the continuous mapping case, we're placing as many loggers and keeping them there as we would doing a normal mapping. So we got that part in place. But what about the protocol? Do we need to have one that's signed off and have all those placed? Do we need to ensure that loggers are in the positions they are? And in the areas where that's still a requirement that you need to perform it more traditionally, it becomes less efficient, but still more efficient than the traditional approach, because you could still do your mappings with the loggers that are in their place. I should mention, I know there's a lot of different vendors out there, but for our system, monitoring loggers and mapping loggers are the same loggers. So whether you keep one or the other in place, I think it just has to do with the amount of documentation that's expected to call it a mapping. But we're also seeing cases where the continuous mapping performance report is enough and is accepted. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Jakob, I'm very conscious of time, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, and one last part. I just launched a book this Thursday. So if you're on temperature mapping, so if you're interested, come to our booth and get a free copy.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.